Well, hello, everybody. It's good to be able to participate in this conference, even though in my case it's only virtual. And I'm glad to have a few moments to talk about ultra-processed foods, plant foods, and soy foods. Ultra-processed foods is a really hot topic, and this is evidenced by all of the articles on ultra-processed foods, some aimed at the consumers, others for health professionals. And here we see just an example of some headlines in ultra-processed foods, such as ultra-processed foods can lead to a second heart attack or stroke, tobacco-style health campaigns needed to spell out ultra-processed food harms, and is ultra-processed food taking over the U.S. diet? These headlines have been generated by an enormous amount of research published on ultra-processed foods over the past several years. You can see, for example, in 2021, the number of articles indexed in PubMed using the term ultra-processed foods was about 250% greater than the number that was indexed in 2019, and the number that it's expected to be indexed in 2022 is going to be considerably greater than last year. Ultra-processed food intake is associated with a range of adverse health outcomes. Here we have the results of a meta-analysis published last year involving 43 observational studies and almost 1 million individuals. You can see ultra-processed food intake is linked with obesity, depression, cancer, breast cancer specifically, a wide range of adverse health outcomes. Now, diabetes is not on this list, although metabolic syndrome is. However, in a subsequently published meta-analysis involving 18 studies and over 1 million individuals who were followed from 5 to 23 years, you can see that ultra-processed food intake was associated with about a 1/3 increased risk of developing diabetes, and that finding was statistically significant. These associations between ultra-processed food intake and adverse health outcomes have led to calls to limit, or in some cases completely avoid, ultra-processed foods. Most notable in this regard is a paper published from the European Office of the WHO, in which the authors called for improving the labeling of ultra-processed foods and restricting the marketing of these foods. Here we have a paper from India published earlier this year in which the authors called for marketing restrictions on ultra-processed foods, applying nutrition warning labels or systems, and taxing these foods. Now, I've talked for about 3 minutes without actually defining ultra-processed foods, so let me take care of that now. Ultra-processed foods is actually a relatively new term. It was created in 2009 when the NOVA food classification system was developed. NOVA is not an acronym. It stands or means new in Portuguese. You can see in this slide I showed previously that the first study, or the first paper that was actually indexed in PubMed using the term ultra-processed food, was published in 2009, the year that NOVA was created. NOVA has been embraced by a number of health agencies around the world, as have the concept of ultra-processed foods. Here we have a paper from the FAO a couple of years ago. The significance of food processing, and in particular of ultra-processed food, is now generally recognized. Several countries include the concept of ultra-processed foods in their diet, in their food-based dietary guidelines. And France set a goal to reduce the consumption rate for ultra-processed foods by 20% by the end of this year. And then finally, very recently, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine weighed in on ultra-processed foods when they were discussing dietary interventions for treating type 2 diabetes. Dietary intervention for sustained remission of type 2 diabetes should minimize ultra-processed foods. And this position paper statement was endorsed by the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Endocrine Society, and the American Association of Clinical Endocrinology. Well, let's take a closer look at the NOVA food classification system. NOVA classifies all foods into one of four groups based entirely on the extent to which they have been processed. It considers all physical, biological, and chemical methods used during the food manufacturing process, including the use of additives. So there are four groups. It's not that easy to determine which food belongs in each group, but we have group one, unprocessed or minimally processed foods. That's easy to understand. These are foods and they're mostly natural state: fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, meat, milk, legumes. Group two are the culinary ingredients: oils, fats, butter, vinegar, sugar, and salt. And then we have group three foods. These are processed foods. They are often a mix of group one and two foods, but other examples include smoked and cured meats, cheeses, fresh bread, bacon, salted sugar, nuts, tinned fruit, beer, and wine. And then most importantly, we have the ultra processed foods, group four foods. These are foods made with non-home ingredients. They often have chemicals, coloring, sweeteners, and preservatives added to them. They are typically high in fat, sugar, and salt, and examples include industrial bread, cereals, sausage, dressings, and snacks. Another definition of ultra-processed foods put forth by the creators of NOVA is industrial formulations of processed food substances that contain little or no whole food and typically include flavorings, colorings, emulsifiers, and other cosmetic additives. So perhaps one way to grasp the concept of these four different food groups is to take the example of corn on the cob. Of course, in its natural state, without anything added to it, it's a group one food. And then you have the culinary ingredients, butter and salt. If you add them to corn on the cob, it can become a group three food. But perhaps a better example of a group three food would be processed corn or canned corn. And then a group four ultra processed food would be corn chips. There are there's a wide range of foods that belong to group four ultra processed foods. You can see biscuits, energy and sports drinks, sweetened juices, pastries, cakes and cake mixes, pre-prepared pizza, pre-prepared poultry and fish nuggets, breakfast cereals and bars, a wide range of foods. So it's not surprising, given the number of foods that are classified as ultra processed, that Americans get about 57% of their caloric intake from ultra processed foods. Now, some researchers have really embraced NOVA, one of whom is David Katz, formerly with Yale University. This is a recent quote from him. The NOVA classification system is a great boon to nutrition research, enabling the study of association of intake levels of junk defined consistently excuse me, with health outcomes. I think many researchers would question this notion that these foods are defined consistently. In fact, here's a paper from Gibney published in 2019, who concluded the exact opposite. There is little consistency either in the definition of ultra processed foods or in examples of foods within this category. Much more recently, French researchers concluded that NOVA criteria do not allow for robust and functional food assignments, and also overall consistency among evaluators was low, even when ingredient information was available. And these conclusions and results are based on an analysis of food by 200 French food and nutrition specialists. Had a very difficult time correctly assigning foods into their NOVA categories, even when they knew the nutrition information, ingredient information. And that confusion is easy to understand when you consider the example of a fruit smoothie. So if you make a fruit smoothie out of fruit, just grinding fruit and adding it to milk, you end up with a group one food because fruit and milk are group one foods. But if you add a concentrated source of protein to that smoothie, whether it's pea protein, soy, or whey, or gluten, whatever, you end up with an ultra processed food, a group four food, even though I would guess most nutritionists would conclude that the smoothie with protein is a better choice than the smoothie without protein. So Nova is by no means uniformly embraced. In fact, one of the more outspoken critics of Nova is Adam Dronowski from the University of Washington in the States. In a recent paper of his, he and his colleagues noted that repurposing published ideas without attribution and for political ends can only be viewed as a questionable research practice. It is therefore surprising that the Nova scheme was recently endorsed by the FAO. I think a real critical question is what accounts for the relationship between ultra-processed foods and adverse health outcomes? Well, we know that processing can affect the physiological effect of a food even without altering nutrient content. So, for example, if you grind peanuts to make peanut butter, you end up absorbing more fat and as a result, more calories. And just canning beans can dramatically increase the glycemic index of dry beans. But I think the question at the heart of the matter is the association between ultra-processed food intake and adverse health outcomes simply a question of diet quality. I mean, there is no question that ultra-processed foods tend to be energy dense and nutrient poor. They also tend to be low cost, which is a point I'll address at near the end of this presentation. So here we see some more specific examples. This is a cross-sectional study from 8 different populations, and we see as ultra-processed food intake increases, the percentage of the population consuming more than 10% of their calories from saturated fat increases in a mostly stepwise fashion. And in the United States, data from N. Haynes shows as ultra-processed food intake going from quintile 1 to quintile 5, you see a stepwise increase in the percentage of calories from added sugars. So clearly the ultra-processed food content of the diet is inversely related to diet quality. However, many researchers suggest that the association between ultra-processed food intake and adverse health outcomes is not entirely or perhaps even at all related to nutrient content. And here's a paper published earlier this year. It's a narrative review that looked at 37 prospective cohort studies and 87 health-related outcomes. And the authors concluded that the adverse consequences of ultra-processed foods are independent of dietary quality or pattern. Here we have the major concerns listed, major concerns about ultra-processed foods. The highlighted ones here deal mostly with nutrient content, but by no means exclusively nutrient content. And the ones highlighted here tend to be independent of nutrient content, such as exposure to additives and plasticizers in ultra-processed foods and the creation of certain compounds as a result of processing. So I want to stop for a moment and address this question, which is, why am I talking about ultra-processed foods? Now, some of you may know that I've spent my career over the past 30 plus years, focused on trying to understand the health effects of soy foods and soybean components. Well, the reason I'm talking about ultra-processed foods is because Nova directly impacts the soy food industry. It impacts it because 90% of plant milks are classified as ultra-processed foods, including soy milk made from whole soybeans. Also, the entire new generation of plant-based meats is classified as ultra-processed foods, and these are plant meats that are made using concentrated sources of protein, could be soy, pea, or gluten, or a combination. Now, there has been, even independent of Nova, some pushback against plant-based meats and to a lesser extent plant milks. You see this sentiment expressed by both consumers and even health professionals: eat foods from plants, not from a plant. Importantly, a paper from the European Office of the WHO earlier this year, they commented on these meat and dairy plant-based substitutes. They may be nutritionally poor, being energy dense and high in saturated fat, free sugars, and salt. And they also concluded, much to my amazement, that they contribute to weight gain and obesity, unlike minimally processed foods such as fruits and vegetables, whole grains, pulses, and nuts. And then finally, a paper published last year, there is a current trend towards eating more highly processed, plant-based convenient foods, which is a concern with regard to both public health and achieving the target of greenhouse gas emissions. So Nova places soy milk and soy-based meat at a disadvantage relative to their animal-based counterparts because, as I've already indicated, soy burgers and soy milk are classified as group 4 foods, whereas their animal-based counterparts, cow's milk and beef or hamburgers, are classified as group 1 foods. These are foods to be encouraged. And this difference in classification, in my opinion, may hinder the adoption of plant-based diets, as these kind of plant-based alternatives make the shift away from animal-based diets easier. So with that background in mind, several of us recently co-authored a paper. One of the co-authors is John Siebenpiper, who hopefully is in the audience today. We addressed the question, are the common criticisms of ultra-processed foods applicable to soy-based meat and dairy alternatives more so than to their animal-based counterparts? And for this paper, we decided to focus specifically on the highlighted concerns or attributes of ultra-processed foods because we consider to be those the most important. And I think out of all of those, the increased energy intake rate associated with ultra-processed foods may be the most important. The increased or the energy intake rate is simply the eating rate of a food, grams per minute, times the energy density of the food, typically expressed as kilocalories per gram. And this is an easy concept to understand when you consider how quickly one can drink a glass of apple juice versus eating an apple, even though the juice has more calories. And personally, I can actually eat a slice of apple pie more quickly than I can drink a glass of juice, even though the pie has about 250% more calories than the juice. Ultra-processed foods really were put on the map, or at least gained additional attention as a result of research published by Hall and colleagues in 2019. And it was specifically the increased energy intake rate that I think really garnered a lot of attention. So this was a crossover study, 2 weeks per phase, 20 overweight adults. During one phase, they consumed a diet comprised of ultra-processed foods. During the other phase, they can consume the diet comprised of unprocessed or minimally processed foods, and the participants can consume as much food as they wanted. And you can see, quite remarkably, during the 2 weeks the participants were consuming the ultra-processed food diet, they gained about a kilogram. When they were consuming the unprocessed food diet, they lost about a kilogram. The difference between the two diets was statistically significant. And while on the ultra-processed food diet, the participants consumed about 500 calories more per day. Quite striking results. And you can see that the energy intake was directly related to the change in body weight. And it wasn't because the foods were deemed, the ultra-processed foods were considered to be more enjoyable or hyperpalatable. The author stated participants did not report significant differences in the pleasantness or familiarity of the meals between the ultra-processed and unprocessed diets. But what you do see is that the participants were able to consume the ultra-processed foods more quickly. That's the blue bar. And the energy intake rate was also greater because they can consume the foods more quickly and the foods were more energy dense. And you can see this point here, they were almost twice as energy dense as the unprocessed foods. So the authors concluded limiting consumption of ultra-processed foods may be an effective strategy for obesity prevention and treatment. So let's get back to the paper that I just referenced, in which we compared the uh, soy foods with the animal-based counterparts. For the soy burgers, we used 5 of the leading burgers in the United States, and we compared the burgers to 80% lean ground beef. And in the case of the milks, we compared the 2 leading soy milks in the US with whole cow's milk, 3.25% fat, and reduced fat cow's milk, 2% fat. Well, you can see from this table that the composition of soy-based burgers does not suggest it would promote a faster energy intake rate than beef. And you can see, for example, here that the energy density was actually, of the soy burgers, was actually a little bit lower, in some cases a lot lower than the beef burger, the hamburger. On a percent calorie basis, the soy burgers were actually higher in protein. And the soy burgers contain anywhere from about 2 to 7 grams of fiber per patty, and of course the hamburger contains none. What about chewing time? For some reason, can you more quickly consume a soy burger than a hamburger? Well, not surprisingly, I didn't find any studies that directly made that comparison. But much to my surprise, I did find a study that compared how quickly you can eat soy-based chicken versus animal-based chicken, and there was no difference in chewing time between the two. What about hyperpalatability? Because hyperpalatability may lead to overconsumption. Well, it's difficult to imagine that plant-based meats could be more palatable than meat because the new generation of plant-based meats is designed to emulate the oral sensory properties of meat. So when you look at these different traits, our conclusion is that the attributes of ultra-processed foods do not apply to soy-based burgers more so than to beef burgers. So what about the case of the soy milk versus cow's milk? Well, begin by looking at macronutrient and fiber content. It's a busy table, so I'll just highlight what I consider to be the most relevant information. And you can see the energy density of the soy milk is actually lower than the energy density of cow's milk. As in the case of the burgers, on a caloric basis, the soy milks are higher in protein than cow's milk. And when you count or include the lactose in cow's milk, the soy milks are actually lower in sugar, and the soy milks contain a couple of grams of fiber per cup, whereas of course cow's milk contains none. So as we concluded for the burgers, the composition of soy milk does not suggest it promotes a greater energy intake rate than cow's milk. Now, not surprisingly, we didn't find any studies that made this comparison, but there's no reason to think that soy milk can be consumed more quickly than cow's milk. What about hyperpalatability? Several groups have looked at the palatability of soy milk, and there's just no evidence the orosensory properties of soy milk are greater than those of cow's milk. Now, we didn't look at glycemic index in the case of the burgers because they're so low in carbohydrate, but that's relevant in the case of the milks. Several groups have studied the glycemic index or determined the glycemic index of soy milk. Here's a paper from 2017. The soy beverage tested in the study performed an estimated glycemic index of 43%, making it a low glycemic index food. So again, when you look at these different traits, we concluded that the attributes of ultra-processed foods do not apply to soy milk more so than they do to cow's milk. And there is some relevant research to discuss, and this comes from researchers at Stanford University who conducted a really unique clinical study. And this is the SWAP meat, the study with the appetizing plant food meat eating alternative trial. And the authors concluded this study found several beneficial effects and no adverse effects from the consumption of plant-based meat. So this was a crossover study, 8 weeks per phase. The study products provided 25% of total calories and about 50% of protein. On the left, you see the animal products that were used, and then on the right, you see the plant-based meat alternatives. Now, these were made with pea protein or a combination of soy and pea, so it wasn't exclusively a soy study. What they found is that at the end of the plant-based phase, um, the TMAO levels were significantly lower, LDL cholesterol levels were lower, and even body weight was lower after consuming the plant-based foods in comparison to the animal-based products. And all those differences were statistically significant. The participants consumed about 2.5 servings of either the plant-based products or the meat-based products. And finally, we need to look at the environmental impact of ultra-processed foods because this has been raised as one concern. Here's a paper from 2020. Significant improvement in food system sustainability requires urgently encouraging limiting ultra-processed food consumption. However, soy protein is very efficiently produced. In fact, in this paper published about a decade ago, of the 22 animal and plant sources of protein that were examined, it was determined that growing soybeans is the most efficient way to produce protein. Of course, most people don't actually eat the whole bean, the bean itself. They eat foods made from soybeans, but these products come off quite well also. Here's a paper from 2017 referring to the concentrated sources of soy protein. The findings of this research identify soy as a key ingredient when trying to mimic the nutrient profile of meat due to its amino acid contribution and its low environmental impact. Earlier this year, a paper was published looking at soy milk. Considering the environmental perspective, soy drink could be a valid substitute of cow's milk. Its production has a lower carbon footprint. One other characteristic or trait we need to consider, and that's cost and pattern of use. Ultra-processed foods tend to be widely available, convenient, they are often non-perishable, ready to eat, inexpensive, and snackable. And these traits or attributes can lead to overconsumption and perhaps body weight gain and obesity. However, soy-based meat and dairy are used similarly to their animal-based counterparts, and they're certainly not less expensive. So I don't think these concerns apply to soy products more than to their animal-based counterparts. So remember, plant-based burgers are not meant to replace a kale salad or a serving of beans. And our conclusion certainly is that placing soy milk and soy burgers in the same NOVA category as high-fat, high-sugar, nutrient-poor snack foods does not make nutritional sense. And remember also that there are a lot of nutrient profiling systems used around the world. And if you look at several of those that are used, the Food Compass was recently developed. What you see is many of the soy and plant-based meat and dairy alternatives that are classified as ultra-processed foods actually score quite well under these other systems. For example, in the Food Compass, 4 out of the 12 receive scores of 70 or above. These are foods that are to be encouraged in the diet. For Health Star, 4 of the foods receive a score of at least 4. 5 is the highest possible score. And then for Nutri-Score, we see that 9 of the foods actually receive the score of A or B, with A being the highest score. So in conclusion, processing is but one factor that affects the nutrient content and quality of a food. The nutritional attributes of ultra-processed foods, group 4 foods, vary greatly. In my opinion, NOVA is too simplistic to guide consumer food purchases. And then finally, soy-based meat and dairy alternatives compare well to their animal-based counterparts and can play a role in healthful plant-based diets. I want to thank you all for your attention. I hope you're enjoying your meeting.